Welcome back to our discussion on MVC. Today's tutorial, we will talk about the model component of MVC. I am Bob Dust, your instructor at Reynolds Community College. You're familiar with this model by now, where we have the user talks to the controller grabs data from the model. This is where our focus will be in this tutorial. Typically, data comes from some type of database. We will see today that we will grab data from another source, and we'll take the data, pass it back to the controller. The controller then decides which view to render, and the view's job is to render the view back to the user. So first we're going to add Entity Framework to our project. To do this, we will go to Tools in the menu, click on NuGet Package Manager, and go to Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. That brings up a search screen. We click on Browse. We type in Entity Framework, and then we select Entity Framework by Microsoft, and we grab the latest stable version. By the time you view this video, it may not be 6.2.0, but whatever the latest version is, we will take that. We will add it to our ITP 244 MVC project, or whatever it is you named your project. Again, make sure we have the latest stable version and click Install. We're going to continue this discussion with our student enrollment system that we used in the previous two tutorials. So under the Models folder, create a new class called ITP 244. Now I renamed the ITP 244 to Student here, and I created a class for Student. I have the constructor method. I have student ID, first name, last name, birth date, and email. And I made all these public properties. Now I did the same thing for course with course ID, tag, the name of the course, how many credits with the constructor. I did the same thing with instructor with instructor ID, first name, last name. Here I added a read-only property called name, which is concatenation of first name and last name, and office hours, along with a constructor. A section is an instance of a course, meaning that this course is offered on this day at these hours by this instructor. So a course can have multiple sections. So notice we have a reference to our course object here, as well as a course ID. And a roster is one student in one section. So we have a student ID, a section ID, and then we have objects for student and section, and we have a nullable grade, which is an enum up here for final grade. And then we add some relationships, one to student, because a student can be in multiple rosters. I hid the properties. All we see is the rosters. And again, all of our collections are plural, and all our properties are singular. We have a list of roster objects, and in the constructor method, we create an instance of the collection. And then we do the same thing to instructor. An instructor can be in multiple sections. And again, in the constructor method, we instantiate the collection of sections. And let's do a quick rebuild of the project. We right-click on the project and click Rebuild. This is actually necessary for some of the controllers to work. So do that. And then we will add a course controller to our project. So we'll go right-click on Controller. We'll click Add Controller. What kind? This time we're going to select MVC 5 Controller with views using Entity Framework. Select that and click Add. In our controller, we will select the course, do the drop down for the model class, select course from our models. Then for the data context class, click the little plus, and we're going to create a new data context class. And we're going to name it BobsDB and click Add. So now we have a new data context class. We're going to generate the views, and we'll use our default layout page. Click Add. Now you notice we have two new files added. Under the controllers folder, we have CoursesController is added. And under our models folder, we have a new file called BobsDB. Let's take a look at BobsDB first. In BobsDB, notice we have a reference to the assembly system.data.entity. The name of the class is BobsDB. That's what we named it earlier. This inherits DB context, which is found in system.data.entity. The purpose of this whole class here, BobsDB, is to give us a reference or connection point to our data. Notice that we have a constructor method here for BobsDB that calls the DB context constructors method and says the name is going to be BobsDB. This is the name of the database. And it also created a DB set collection here of course. It's called courses. So not a lot going on here, but it's going to be a great tool to add to our project here. Okay, so let's look at our courses controllers. If you drop down the class method box over here in the upper right hand corner of your Visual Studio, you'll see that there have been several methods or actions already added for us. One of which is DB, which is a reference to our BobsDB, which we just saw in the previous slide. And then it has, here's the index method, but it has several other methods as well. Okay, so let's just run this. Let's see our courses. I'm going to right click on the project properties manager. I'm going to select web. Now I'm going to start with the courses/index page. Let's go back a slide, and you see the courses.index page has an action result, returns a view, and it points to, model is going to go to the database, the DB, which is BobsDB, going to grab the courses, and it's going to make a to list out of it. If you notice here in our app data, in our Solution Explorer, this folder is empty at the moment. Just keep that in mind. Then next we will click on IIS Express, Microsoft Edge, or whatever browser you choose. And let's run our application. Here we see we have our courses index, and of course we have no data here, and so we click the Create New button, and a little screen comes up. We can add in a course tag of ITP 236. The name is C#2, the credits is 4, and we click the Create button here, and we go back to our index, and now we see we have a course in our database. It added this is our index view of the course. It added the course ITP 236, C#2, 4 credits, and has some tags out here. So where did it put this data? If we go back to our app data folder, we see that the new file has been created called BobsDB. This is an MDF file. This is an example of code first with Entity Framework, meaning that we wrote the classes first. We did student, course, section, instructor, and roster. And then when we ran the program, it created the database for us. And we didn't specify where to put the database. So it says if you don't specify, I'm going to put it in app data. I'm going to call it the DB name. I'm going to give it a date and time stamp, and it'll be an MDF format. So let's revisit BobsDB code. Remember, it did courses for us. Let's add 2 more. One for students, which will be a student type. One for instructors, which will be an instructor type. So add those. Let's do one more thing. We're going to add a new class called BobsDbInitializer. BobsDbInitializer. So what this will do, this is going to inherit a system data entity called drop create database always and drop create BobsDB. What this will do is every time we start our project, it will blow out the data we have, and we're going to create new data. So we're going to populate our database every time we run our application. Now, we only want to do this when we are developing the project. Obviously, we don't want to do this in production. But for us to start out, this allows us to start with a clean slate every time we run the product in debug mode, so that we can see, make sure we have a standard and consistent data source. So I'm going to add a student here, add new student to my db.students. Okay, and that's the DB up here. I'm going to add to the students a new student, student ID 1, Annabelle Lee, with the birth date of something. Now, I'm just showing here, I added 2 more students. Similarly, I added 1 instructor, and I added 2 courses. And then we seed our database with that. And every time we start, we will already have a database. That's step 1. One more step to do. Next, we go to our Global.asax file. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to create a compile time variable called debug. And I put a comment here so I can uncomment or undefine this easily later on. Then I'm going to write code down here. It says, if this is debug has been defined, then call database.setInitializer, and I'm then going to call my new instance of BobsDbInitializer. And then we have the indif. So Global.asax runs every time the application starts. First thing it's going to do is populate our test data. Then I'm going to go to my layout file, and I'm going to modify my menu. I'm going to add a couple of action links for courses and for students. Again, this is in my layout under views, shared, layout. I'm modifying my menu. So let's run the application again. This time, notice, first time we run this thing, we have 2 courses here. These are the 2 courses that were added using the DB initializer. So now I can start my test. I know what my data is each time I do it, and it will repopulate my database file and the app data. All right, so let's do the same thing for students. Our course is looking good. Let's take a look at our student now. Now I replicated what I did for course for student. I created a controller and all the views and everything. So let's use this and see what we have. So let's run our details for a particular student and see what we get. Notice also, I meant to point this out earlier, our menu has changed, so now we have courses and students up here. So I run the details, and I see I have my first student, Annabelle Lee, with a birth date, and I have some labels here that look fine to you and me because we're a couple of geeks here. It says first name, last name, birth date, but there's no space in it, because that's the way we're used to seeing variable names with no spaces. But for normal people who are not geeks, they're thinking, what is this? It's kind of hard to read. So what we want to do is we want to clean this up a little bit so the user interface looks a little cleaner. Now you would think we would go to the view to do this. Actually, we're not. We're going to go to the model and change it there. So we're going to add something called Data Annotations. To do that, we add a reference to system.componentModel.dataAnnotations. And for first name, here's my variable first name. I'm going to add a property attribute called display. I'm going to set the name property to first space name. Again, this goes right above the property for first name. Let's run the application again, and this time we can see we have first space name. Without changing the view, we allow the data model to be consistent in how it names things. That way we keep this in one place. The view doesn't have to worry about how we spell it and do it the same way every time. It grabs that metadata, if you will, right from the model itself. Let's have the ones for last name and birth date. We got last name is a attribute for the last name property, birth space date for birth date, and for, I added this where you weren't looking, I added a full name property, which is the concatenation of first name, last name, so let's call that student. Okay. And then email doesn't need one because email is email. Now let's run our student details again. You see we have first space name, last space name, birth space date, and email. Okay. Remember we have that first name, last name. We named it student. Notice how it shows up here in our index for student. Here's student, There's my student from that first name, last name. Now let's click on Create New, and let's create a new student. You notice right now we have 3 students, Hannibal Lee, Huguenot, and Skipwith. Okay, so let's bring up the Create Student view. We have first name, last name, birth date, email. Let's just click Create immediately. We'll click Create. And notice we have Annabelle Lee, Huguenot, Skipwith like before. Now we have a blank, empty student. That's not good. Notice that? We have a new row here, but there's no name for it. Let's take care of that. We're going to go back to our Data Annotations, and we're going to add another property modifier called required. This says that for this model to work, I must have a value for first name, and I must have a value for last name. Let's run this again. We'll do the same thing. Bring up the Create, click Create, and notice we have a message here. The first name field is required, and the last name field is required. Nice, huh? Notice how we're controlling these property values in the model itself, not directly in the user interface. Now, if we don't like the message fields and required and all that, that's kind of curt, I guess. Let's modify the error message. We're going to, in our required, we're going to have a parenthesis error message equal, please enter a first name. Just a little nicer, and we don't have the word field in there because a lot of users don't know what field means. So now we try this again, and the error message is, please enter a first name, because we modified our required property attribute. Okay, so let's look at birth date now. Do the same thing for birth date over here. Display name, we had this before. We're going to say this data type is date, and display the date as month, day, and 4-digit year. So we're telling the view, if you want, here is a standard way to render this date. Again, we do this in the model, so the view doesn't have to be concerned with doing this every time and perhaps being inconsistent. Let's try this again to see how it looks. Notice we have a fancy little pop-up now for a little calendar. May not be the most elegant, but it's effective. When we click on the birth date, we can choose our month, day, and year of the birth date. Click on the little check marks there, and we have entered the date. A few more things here. Let's look at email. One of the things we want to do with email is make sure they enter what appears to be, at least format-wise, a valid email. And the only way to make sure it is truly a valid email is, of course, to send them an email and have them verify it, which you have probably seen dozens of times. Now, this is some gibberish up here. I'm not going to explain all this, but regular expressions is a property attribute called regular expression that says we will check the formatting of whatever you enter here. Again, if you're interested in knowing more about regular expressions, you can Google that and see what options you have here. Okay, and then the error message is going to be, if it doesn't match this expression, will be please enter a valid email format. So let's run this and see what we get. So here I typed in bdus space Reynolds.edu, and it says, excuse me, that is not a valid email format. and we get the error message, please enter a valid email format. Again, it doesn't verify that the email is valid, it just verifies that the format is valid. Okay, let's do one more. Now, I'm not going to demo this, I'm going to show you that for first name, we can add a string length attribute, 25 characters. If you go more than 25 characters, it will display name must be less than 25 characters. Now, again, I'm going to demo that. You can kind of figure out what, and test that if you want, what the result will be. So that covers our model for the MVC. I am still Bob Dust, and I'm still the instructor at Reynolds Community College.